Thanks for choosing this topic. It seems absolutely appropriate for the theme of attempting to get to grips with a new vision for education in New Zealand. I think I'm here in front of you, though I'm from London, because last year I published a book called Thrive, Reinventing Schools for the Real Challenges We Face. And that theme seems absolutely appropriate for what you guys are thinking about. And I want to take you through that argument and see if some of these ideas help provoke you into getting closer to what you think your new vision for education in New Zealand ought to be. It happened because I was asked to write a paper for a research journal with that question, what is education for? And I thought, I refused. I said, it's a damn fool question. It's bloody obvious what it's for. I mean, ridiculous. And actually, here's my thing. If you start to ask that question seriously in the conditions of the 21st century, I don't think it's any more completely obvious. It is much more complicated than that. And that's what I want to try and convince you of today. So, everything starts with a story that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And if the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves is that what we're about is success and prosperity, and our story as a nation is growing GDP, that is what we will become. Our stories about ourselves, our very nature, is critical to the whole piece. And I think that what we need actually is a new narrative for education, one that starts with purpose, which is why I was delighted to spend 2 days traveling to get to you, because you are one of the only nations on earth right now. There are a handful of others who are starting to ask that really fundamental question. And good on you for doing it, because it's a very tough one. But what is the purpose? And I want to offer you this notion that actually your new vision needs to be grounded in the new purpose. And here's a suggestion, that actually the purpose needs to be learning to thrive in a transforming world. And I've got 15 minutes to talk about the two parts of that equation. One, what is it to thrive today? I'm not saying succeed, notice. I'm not talking about be happy. I'm talking about thriving. And that's a biological metaphor that I want to explore with you a bit more. And then secondly, is it really a transforming world? When I started to write the book, people said to me, Valerie, you're overdoing this, you know, there's always been change. If you lived around the time of the Industrial Revolution, you'd have been saying, oh my God, it's a transforming world. We've never seen anything like this before. But I want to argue with you that actually our species, Homo sapiens, has never encountered change such as this generation is about to do. So I'm going to deal with two parts very fast. One, the idea of what it is to thrive and what evidence we've got around thriving and how holistic a concept that is. But I'm going to start with the idea of this transforming world and the scale of the changes which this new generation are facing. That's the book if you want to follow up, and if you don't believe what I'm saying, the references, the evidence is all in there. I'm not trying to flog it. I don't get any royalties for it, so it's up to you. Anyhow, what good evidence do we have about the upcoming 30 years? Now, if you go to any kind of futurist conference, you get kind of bombarded with all these facts, and it just kind of gives you a headache. But in preparing the book, what I realized was it is possible to organize the changes facing us into kind of three big clumps or buckets. And the scale of it has been captured really well by a guy called Klaus Schwab. He's the man who founded Davos, the World Economic Forum. And he wrote a book, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, which looks actually, yes, at the Industrial Revolution, but beyond it. And here was his conclusion. He said, the changes are so profound that from the perspective of human history, there has never been a time of greater promise or potential peril. And I want to emphasize those two pieces, because a lot of this will sound like catastrophizing, or on the brink of catastrophe, but also there is huge, huge promise. My concern, he writes, however, is that the decision makers are too often caught in a traditional, linear, non-disruptive thinking, or too absorbed by immediate concerns to think strategically about the forces of disruption and innovation shaping our lives. And I think that's absolutely true, and that's partly the driver that's brought you here today. So, I think the evidence from scholarship across a whole range of fields suggests that we have a series of three major tipping points or pivots in this 21st century. The first is around our planet. The second is around the apotheosis of technology assuming godlike proportions. And thirdly, our own evolution as a species. These are the tipping points which our species has never faced before. So what about our planet? And I think there are 3 strands to us being at a tipping point, some of them absolutely existential. The first is the 6th great extinction, the second, the Anthropocene age, and the third, climate change. 3 strands feeding into who knows where our planet will end up. And if you haven't heard of it, this is a new field, a great deal being written about it now. 5 previous extinctions, all caused by natural causes. The 6th, if any biologists are in the room, caused by us. And the scale of it is truly mind-bending. I could spend the rest of our 35 minutes talking about that 6th extinction, just to say that something like 50% of all mammals are threatened in the next 40 years. If you look at the bird population, there were new data published in The Guardian last week about the number of species threatened with extinction. Does it matter? Well, some people say, well, it matters because it'll affect our health. Like everyone got really upset about the bees getting infected in our country. Anyway, you probably were immune to it, but they were starting to disappear. And people said, well, the problem is it will affect our crops. I don't want this to be anthropocentric. Do we have a moral right to see the end of biodiversity on our planet, as if we are the lords of all creation, and as long as we're okay, the hell with the rest of them? Question. So the first piece of the tipping point for our planet is that 6th extinction. The second is we have entered a new geological age. I don't know if there's any geologists in the room, but we've now entered the Anthropocene. This is the new age in which the structure of our very planet is being changed by the actions of humans. Concreting over, drilling 50 kilometers down into the earth for oil, removing mountains for coal, we are changing the very nature of our planet, leaving our signature on its strata. And the third is climate change. And with this sophisticated audience, I don't need to argue the existence of climate change, just to say that the treaty that was reached in Paris in 2016, which everybody signed up to, has now really been given a kicking by the electoral results in certain countries over the last 2 years. And we stand in huge peril because we are not controlling the rise in the surface temperature of the Earth. And you guys all know the consequences of that in terms of where will be livable on our planet. So taken together, we see our planet being at a tipping point, which our species has never been at before, and we are responsible for it. The second area I want to talk about is technology and control, and I think there are 3 strands to this. First, the scale of job disruption by robotics. Secondly, artificial intelligence. And thirdly, global connectivity. And sorry, you want to take a photograph? Take it. The last one I'm going to start with because that is where the promise lies. The global connectivity which we and our future generations are going to enjoy is unprecedented. Someone's captured this in the term big mind. It is as though we are creating a single big mind through phenomenal computing power, capacity to share ideas, create ideas, produce knowledge, share knowledge, and co-create it. That has never happened before. We've been atomized as individuals, but we are creating big mind. Secondly, though, and this is a poor slide, and I apologize if you can't read it very well, the potential job automation rates because of robotics really cannot be underestimated. So these 3 graphs, you don't need to worry about them, but this takes you to the mid-2030s, called Wade 3. By the way, the report is from PwC, the huge accountancy and consultancy company, which published it last month. So it's on your screen because it's the very latest data we have. And if you see the dark line, that's all sectors of all economies, it says that 30% of all jobs will be impacted by the mid-2030s. Looked at another way, 44% of workers with low education skills will be at risk of automation by the mid-2030s. Now, this is not an uncontested area. Labour economists bicker about it, but even if this is something like 50% wrong, that is huge. This is a seriously huge impact on the way in which work is available, the way in which work is structured, and our expectations about employment in our lives. And I argue in my book that actually we're going to have to start to see employment very differently. Perhaps differently distributed. Is it right that some people will be working 24/7, 360 days a week? Maybe work should be distributed in a way in which we work much less, have much more leisure, and more people are involved in work. But that will create a huge difference in our mindset. Where, you say, is the money coming from? Well, it is coming, because despite the loss of jobs, the increase in the global GDP by 2030 is assessed to be $15 trillion. So there will be more prosperity, but less work. Think about that. More prosperity, but less work. And so the role of work in our societies and for individuals must shift. Now, we can let that happen by chance, and you know where that will lead, to a kind of huge underclass, I think. Or we can rethink how work is distributed. So that's that. And of course, the robots are with us everywhere. Has anybody met a now? Anyone met now? Yes? Okay. Well, this one's working in the Mitsubishi Banks in Tokyo. Speaks 19 languages, got facial recognition software, so that if you come in looking a bit grumpy, I'm going to be very gentle with you. Give you a lot of TLC. Fantastic employee, never takes breaks, never sick, never wants a rise, brilliant employee. And actually, people really like interacting with him, her. So do kids in schools. This is a school in South Australia where nows are being used as teaching assistants. And we're talking about the professions being impacted by artificial intelligence. It is already happening. This is Sophia. Sophia, as you can see, is a robot on account of her head is showing, but she just gave a speech at the United Nations on sustainability in the age of artificial intelligence. Notice, she wasn't a tape recorder recording somebody else's speech. She wrote the speech. Given a load of data, she put the speech together and she delivered it. Now look, they revealed her head to show that she's a robot, but they could have made her look like that. That's Yang Yang. She's a hotel receptionist. And I think she's absolutely charming myself, and she has all those skills. So the impact of technology, of robotics onto employment is absolutely vast. And then my third tipping point, evolution in our own hands. And this is the one that really blows my mind out, really, because up until now, our evolution as a species has been like all other species, proceeding by natural selection. However, we now have genetic engineering, convergence of human bodies with artificial intelligence, and human enhancement technologies, HETs. All of you are enhanced probably in some way. I am. I've had lens replacement. If you've got a new hip or a new knee. But my God, the extent to which now human enhancement technologies have extended is absolutely extraordinary. And I simply don't have time to go into it today, but I will talk about the first two. Because genetic engineering is now a reality. In the UK last year, scientists were given the permission by Human Embryology Authority to use discarded embryos from IVF procedures to work on genetic engineering. They had to discard the embryos at the end, but we are well down the path, not perhaps quite of that. Here you are, choose your sample design, what would you like? But we are in a position now to genetically engineer our future as a species. Never, ever happened before in our history. And that is why I want to say we are at a point we have never reached before of tipping points for our species. Now, that's the next 30 years. But what about thriving? And I'm sorry if this is too pale. I can see some of you frowning at the back. This is my suggestion about how we ought to be thinking about thriving in the light of those huge shifts which are going to affect our species. And it's not just about societies, and it's not just about us as individuals. There are 4 levels of thriving, surely. One is thriving at the planetary and the global level. One is thriving at the societal level as a community. One is thriving at the interpersonal level and the level of relationships, human to human. And one is thriving at the intrapersonal level, you, yourself, alone as an individual. And these 4 levels are intimately correlated. No man, as the poet said, is an island, though they might want to be. So what is it to thrive at all of those 4 levels? And what does it mean for education? Bearing in mind what I've just said about the changes which are going to affect our planet in the very near future. I've got 5 minutes left to talk about what they might be. And I'm going to start, some people think this is inside out, but I'm going to start with the planetary and the global level of thriving. Well, I think this. if we want to thrive at the global level, our learning goals for future education systems should be at least 3. We should be learning to live sustainably as a core, absolutely central endeavour, not as some module in science education or biology or geography, but actually as a central intention of what learning should be for. Because if we don't learn to do it, we are toast. Learning to live sustainably. Secondly, protecting the Earth's ecosystem, other species, the territory itself. And thirdly, acquiring global competence. Because it's not just about the physical planet, it's about the social planet as well. And I love to say this in New Zealand, where in contrast to societies like Australia, I would have to say, you have developed a level of bicultural competence, which I think is absolutely extraordinary. It's partly why I love to come to New Zealand to see that in effect. I wish I could say the same for the United Kingdom. But that needs to extend to global competence. And whilst a few years ago that would have seemed a slightly wacky idea, what the hell is global competence? Now it is a very well-developed area of education. And I say again, rather than being on the margins, I believe it has to be absolutely at the central, because it's critical to a peaceful planet. It is critical to a planet where migration, in the light of everything I've said about what's happening on the climate change and elsewhere, is going to be a phenomenon that we're all going to have to get used to. So for a peaceful, thriving planet, I would say those are the goals that a new vision for education ought to embrace. Secondly, by the way, I put that up because this is a book that's really, really impacted me about how young people learn to live sustainably and reverence their planet, actually reverence it. And again, I think because of the contribution of your indigenous communities in this country, you understand what reverencing the planet looks like. And this book is showing how in schooling today, kids actually getting out into wilderness, being in the woods, not in the playground, experiencing nature deeply is almost becoming unknown. Perhaps not in this country, but in many other countries of the planet, it is extraordinary for kids to be anything other than in a concrete jungle. How can they love and revere their planet and learn to grow it well if they don't get out there? So that's why I tucked that one in. Okay, second level of thriving in is societal. New Zealand, as a community, as a society. I suggest there are 2 big goals that ought to inform a new vision for learning. One is to navigate a disrupted and uncertain landscape of work. And the second one is to reinvent a participative, authentic, meaningful democracy. Why do I say those 2 things? And it's to do with the evidence on thriving. Because this is not just ideology or my opinion. This book is a really, really important book called The Spirit Level. And it was done by a couple of British sociologists who took data on a wide number of countries. I forget how many countries, but all the countries that they could find data on. And the data were about thriving. So they had something like 14 indicators, and you could guess what they are. They're things like postnatal mortality rates, early infant death, low literacy rates, levels of incarceration in prison, levels of mental health, suicide, levels of employment, homelessness. You can imagine, can't you, what would be the indicators of a thriving society? And they compared these nations, and their finding, I think it's absolutely fascinating, which is this, that the societies who scored really well on all of those indicators, in other words, which were thriving societies, were not the richest. The societies which really did well on those indicators were the ones which distributed their resources equitably. In other words, it's equity that makes for thriving societies. And that's why they called it the spirit level, why equality is better from everyone. In other words, if you want a thriving society, don't be chasing after growing your GDP at the expense of everything else. Chase equity, because that's what makes you thrive. How do we get equity in our societies? Well, as far as I know, the best lever to achieving that is democracy. You could argue it with Chinese if they were here. They have a different model. But I'm not ashamed to say, with my values, liberal democracy is the best way to achieve equity. And, colleagues, democracy is in trouble. Because if you look at the data, Google them yourselves about young people's attitudes towards democracy, they actually don't think it's worth fighting for anymore because it's disappointed them. And you can understand why. And that's why I suggest to you that one of the needs that we have in order to have a thriving society is to recreate democracy in ways that kids need to learn in schools. So one of the things I want to throw on your tables is, how is schooling, how is education enabling kids to get to grips with the kind of democracy that you want to have in New Zealand? And it sure as hell is more than going to vote every 3 years. It's got to be participative. It's got to be meaningful. It's got to be authentic. And they've got to recreate it. And I think that they need to have the experiences in schools that will help them come to terms with doing that. So that's why I say reinventing a participative, authentic and meaningful democracy is a really important goal if you want a thriving society. And then secondly, navigate a disrupted and uncertain landscape of work. You probably all know this graph. In the 20th century, you maybe had one field and a couple of jobs. 21st century, predicted to work in 17 jobs, 5 careers. This was done some time ago, and I need to update it, because frankly, now, with the gig economy, with portfolio careers, it's down to you, to the individual, constantly to be capable of shifting field, to learn and relearn new skills. So if anything happens, kids not necessarily coming out of schools knowing the career they want, the career may be totally disrupted by artificial intelligence within 10 years. What they need to be able to do is learn to navigate that, to learn new skills, to learn, relearn, and love learning. Third level of thriving, interpersonal, the relational. My evidence on this, again, it's not opinion, is the director of the Adult Development Study of Harvard, who last year reported their results on the longest ever adult learning survey. And it was 75 years old, and they studied these, I was going to say people, but it was actually all men, because researchers were really interested in men 75 years ago. But the finding was a straightforward one. He said, I've got reams of evidence to show you, but my conclusion can be summed up in a single sentence. Great relationships make for good lives. And you feel like saying, really? Did we need all that study to tell us what we already knew? But at the same time, maybe we did, because we need to really emphasize as strongly as we can that relationships are fundamental to our thriving. And what space do we give in schools for learning how to make great relationships, learning how to make a friend and keep a friend, and to show empathy? I don't think that's something that can just be left to chance. Do you think you're just born with the skill? Or do you think it's a learnable skill? Because I think it's learnable. I think learning how to make and keep relationships is a learnable skill, and we should be addressing it. And I think, secondarily, that we ought to be engaging with and learning from other generations. I'll come on to that in a moment. But what I want to say is this. If you think learning relationships, learning how to make and keep relationships was difficult, in a society where kids are sometimes called the Mowgli generation, being brought up not by wild animals in the forest, but being brought up by screens, is more problematic. Because what is at the heart of great relationships? It's empathy. And do you grow empathy from looking at screens, or do you grow empathy from being with kids, being with people, and managing to make those relationships differently? The technologizing of our society that I talked about earlier is penetrating even how we make relationships. And if you don't believe me, meet Harmony. Harmony is being manufactured on the west coast of America. She's the first of a new breed of sex robots. On the paper on the way over here on the flight, I came across Annabelle, who's another one. She's absolutely gorgeous. She's got beautiful skin, silicone. Probably you'll be able to choose the face quite soon. You can choose, Angelina Jolie or whoever you like. And note, she is not a sex doll. She is someone with animatronics. She's got artificial intelligence, so she learns you. She knows your birthday, she knows your brother, she knows what you want to talk about, and she'll give you a good conversation, and she moves. She moves. So this sex robot, the other thing, of course, she never says no. Now, what is the entrance of sex robots in our society meaning for the making of our relationships? Loving and respectful relationships. And I'll say one more thing about technology, and then I'll stop, which is that if you look at the data on the age at which children of 12 start to access, sometimes involuntarily, online pornography. It is truly shocking. And I'm not a prude about this thing, but I know that access to and exposure to pornography leads to objectified views of women and a clear straight line between that and abuse. So learning, loving, respectful relationships in a technologized society is more difficult than ever before. And I believe and I argue that that issue should be squarely on the table in schools, not as an afterthought, not as a nice to have, but as absolutely fundamental. And now I'll finish with the final frontier, intrapersonal, thriving as an individual. Because if you aren't a healthy, well-balanced individual, you can't impact on all the rest. And maybe this has been started first. But don't we need to enable kids to learn a secure sense of self, to learn their identity, who they are, their sense of purpose in the world, to be calm themselves and capable of being silent in a world where they're never offline, never ever disconnected, where there's a constant noise of connectivity. And so I think one of the things we need to do in our schools is give kids the opportunities, the learning opportunities to find out who they are. Was it that great Joni Mitchell line in her song? I don't know who I am, but life is for learning. And we need to put that centrally, I believe. It's a question of this. Do you want the outcome of your learning system to be mindful, or do you want it to be mindful? And what are the tools that we have or can create for schools to start to put that central stage? So that's my 15 minutes up. But when I say the idea I want to leave you with is this. Debating what it will mean to thrive could just be the real inspiration for the vision that's needed. But thriving in the new conditions of the 21st century is very different. There is some continuity, but there are some big changes to come. And so that's what I offer you as a starter for 10. Now, I think we've got about 20 minutes. 15. Okay, so let me suggest this. Would you like to take 5 minutes around your tables to critique, to share what has resonated with you, come up with something that you want to challenge maybe, or come up with something that you think has got some juice, some energy, and that you might want to take into the next round?